Hello, everybody. Welcome to what is our first proper lecture of the course. And we're going to spend some time in this lecture talking about American history before European colonialism, when the only people that were in North or South America were Native Americans. So we're going to be talking about the United States before it was the United States. So I invite you to enter this world, this framework, where you're imagining this land that you're so familiar with, stripped of its connotations and connections to the United States government, right? To the state of America, or the United States of America. And this is important because there is usually a problem in the way we conceptualize quote-unquote American history, as though there is no history in the United States, no civilization that counts, until Europeans showed up. The very fact, for example, that we often casually refer to the country as America rather than the United States, when all of North and South America is America, right, is a good illustration of how we tend to equate the fate and the destiny and the essence, really, of America with specifically the United States and its formation. So we're going to talk about a time before any of that happened. And we're going to look at some native cultures and some native civilizations and try to complicate some of the stereotypes that most non-native people receive from the broader society. So along the way, we're also going to talk a bit about South America and the arrival of the Spanish, because these are our earliest sources, because this was the first contact, Spanish in South America and Central America. And so our earliest sources for working out how the first encounters between Europeans and native peoples played out came from these encounters with the Spanish and later the Portuguese. So let's think about how our culture usually presents or thinks about Native Americans. Now, historically, there's two dominant ways that white Americans have thought about Native Americans, two basic stereotypes, and that is the barbaric savage and the noble savage. Notice in each, we're dealing with the image of a savage. We're dealing with the idea of a people who do not have civilization, what Europeans recognized as civilization. But otherwise, they run in different directions. In the barbaric savage stereotype, right, these Native Americans that Europeans encountered were without morals, were without usual human feeling, and were really just vicious, right, and almost closer to other animals, right, than human beings, since all human beings are, of course, also animals. On the other hand, you had the noble savage, the idea that Native American peoples were also fundamentally different from other human beings, but in a more sentimental way, that they were uncorrupted, that they were pure, kind of like children. Now, this is kinder in a sense, but it's a stereotype that removes the full humanity from Native American people, right? They're not allowed to run the gauntlet and have all of the usual human characteristics because they're sort of pure children that had been traipsing around in Eden or something, right, before Europeans arrived. And that only is slightly better, right, than understanding them in this other limited and negative stereotypical way as barbaric savages. Quick example of sort of noble savage ideas in action, if you've ever seen the movie Dances with Wolves, that's a very idealized, purified conception of what Native American societies were like, where the European societies are all bad and the Native American societies are all peaceful. And so again, it seems nicer, right, and less stigmatizing than a barbaric savage, and it certainly is, but it's still in some way regarding them as something different than most human beings. So it's still very problematic and steeped in this tradition of viewing Native people as not fully civilized. It's just that in this case, in the noble savage case, that's being sentimentalized about. Now, another problem with typical stereotypes, casual thinking about Native Americans is how they're often viewed as one group with no significant differences. They're all the same, in other words, right? Whether you're in North America, South America, whether you're on the East Coast, in the Southwest, up in Alaska, they're all just Native Americans. But this is in fact not true. These different civilizations had very different cultures. They had different ways of interacting with the environment. And we're going to go over and look at a few in closer detail to kind of get a feel for that. So Native cultures were quite diverse, as you would expect them to be, based on various historical accidents and how they interacted with different natural environments in which they found themselves, right? If you are living up in the Arctic Circle, things are going to look an awful lot different than if you're down in the arid Southwest. So all of this pushes us towards trying to find a more historical perspective. So let's start with a couple of key aspects about Native American cultures and European cultures that kinds of brings us down to the historical similarities, differences, and accidents that impacted both of these cultures. First, both Indian and European societies were violent. Neither of them had a monopoly on violence. However, because of these historical accidents, or historians often call them contingencies, you'll probably hear that word a lot, contingencies, European society at the point of contact and for hundreds of years after were much more capable of inflicting violence. They had much more access to the power and the resources needed to effectively inflict that violence. European society was also much more destructive to the environment than Native American societies, and we'll talk a little bit more about some reasons for that, or at least one in particular as the lecture goes on. But suffice to say for the moment that all the Europeans that arrived in America portrayed the natural abundance in the Americas in contrast to the relative destruction of ecosystems and the limits of biodiversity in Europe. So it was something that all European societies, whether Spanish, Portuguese, French, Dutch, British, noticed when they arrived in the United States, right? How lush, how full of resources, how not destroyed right, the environment was, and the number of different species and animals that were flourishing in the American environment. So on the point which they meet each other, European societies are much more destructive of the environment than Native American societies, right? They've been doing a better job at destroying their environment back in Europe for hundreds of years. But any historical perspective has to recognize that historically, Native Americans also have their own understanding of and version of history. So we're going to be doing a pretty typical European history perspective in this lecture, right? Lots of dates, lots of facts and figures. Chronology moves forward in a straight line. But just keep in mind that this is not how Native American peoples themselves would likely understand or tell their story. So we have to recognize their resistance to a Western or European historical perspective because they have their own lore and their own history that they consider to be the true story of themselves and their experience. This does not mean that we need to quote-unquote believe in any literal sense in the myths and legends and histories of Native peoples, but we do have to understand that they are historically important because they informed Native Americans' own understanding of themselves, and therefore they shaped how they experienced what happened to them. We'll look at a key example of that at the very end of the lecture when we look at a poem written by an Aztec about the Spanish destruction of their society. All right, so back to doing history, though, the Western way. How much can we figure out about the history of indigenous people in North and South America? Well, archaeological evidence suggests that America was the last continent to be inhabited by people, South America specifically, right? Because there's North America and South America. South America was the last one to be peopled by America. So they started out in North America about 15,000 years ago when the inhabitants of Siberia, who lived in small bands, started migrating west into Alaska in pursuit of herds of mammals, such as now extinct mammoths, woolly rhinos, and Muck's Oscan. So there was this land bridge temporarily caused by the Ice Age and lower sea levels that you could just walk across. Now this migration continued on sea to a lesser extent after the climate changed and it was no longer walkable, but the major migration happened by walking across the Bering Strait land bridge while it existed. Now, despite, the disappearance of land bridge, right, spotty migration was still possible by boat, but the majority you get here. Now, this group of Native American people who migrated between 15,000 years ago and 9,000 years ago are known by archaeologists as Paleo-Indians, and that's how they refer to the first hunter-gatherer groups that inhabited America. If you take a look at the map here, you can see the route they took from Asia over the Bering Strait and into North and South America. And it took them about 6,000 years to get from the tip of North America all the way down to South America. About 9,000 years ago, humans reached the southernmost parts of America. Now, both climate warming and hunting, as we mentioned, the climate warming, we mentioned that, and hunting of those animals they followed across brought about the extinction of about 2/3 of the large mammals, such as this giant beaver, right? There are giant beavers as big as bears wandering around, but there are also ground sloths, giant ground sloths, the mammoth, of course, American horses, and camels. There were camels in America before they went extinct due to a combination of climate warming and human hunting. Now, Native Americans who lived in the Archaic period, which is 9,000, here we'll go back real quick to look at this, right, the Archaic period, which is about 9,000 to 3,000 years ago, so from the point that they reached the end bottom tip of South America until 3,000 years ago, this is referred to, as the Archaic period. And most Native American societies developed more specific hunting-gathering practices during that time period, depending on their respective environments. Now, in temperate climates, let me go here, just let you look at that beaver a bit more. In temperate climates, they lived in semi-permanent settlements. So this temperate climate applies to most of the United States, right? It's neither too hot or too cold most of the year. And such settlements, these semi-permanent settlements, involved a various combination of strategies. Often, Native people would modify their environment to increase yields of plants and animals that sustain them. For example, one of the most common practices in many areas was burning undergrowth. And this stimulated the growth of grazing pasture. And the reason they would do this, right, burn the underbrush in these foresty areas, is to create more environments that the animals that they hunted, right, largely grazing animals, would want to show up and graze in, right? So they are sustaining good environments for their prey. And in this way, they attracted and nourished a population of game for hunting. Now, in other places, they also weeded out inedible plants, which created larger cluster of edible plants that were more useful to them. So one thing I want to make note of is that they did change the environment. Often a stereotype that goes towards this sort of noble savage idea is that Native people just lived in nature, right? Rather than altering it or interacting with it to manipulate it, they just lived in harmony with it, right? It was just kind of like they got along really well. But in fact, Native American peoples developed different strategies to manipulate their environment, right? They didn't just sort of leave it untouched. Now, in this time period as well, this 9,000 to 3,000 years ago, the Native American societies in North and South America became more and more distinguished culturally from one another, so they started developing distinct beliefs and languages. Something else that started happening after this period, a little over 3,000 years ago, is horticulture, or growing food, or gardening, or agriculture, right? Take your pick of all those words that mean the same thing. And this developed in Central America first, a little over 3,000 years ago, and then it spread throughout the continents. Now, in different places, natives incorporated different horticultural practices, different agricultural practices, or None at all, depending on their specific environment. So it varied from environment to environment, right? If you're way up in the Arctic Circle, gardening is not really going to be a thing that's going to help you out much, right? So it depended on where you were, what combination of strategies you would use or not use at all. In some places, they created quite sedentary settlements, and in other places, such as the cold north or high elevations, they used very little or no gardening or agriculture at all, and depended instead primarily on hunting and gathering. For the places that did develop agriculture, the most three important crops were maize, which is corn, beans, and squashes. So we're just going to look at a few examples now of two different types of cultures that existed in North America in the contemporary United States. First, the Hohokam and Anasazi is about 300 to 1100 AD, right? So in the Common Era. And by the way, I will probably butcher a lot of the pronunciation here. I apologize ahead of time. And they lived in the American Southwest. You have a map here of their territory. Now, these names, the Hohokam and Anasazi, are not referring to unified societies that all identify as the same culture, but rather a more loose cultural common denominator or a general grouping of people that archaeologists have recognized as similar enough to consider them as part of the same basic sphere. That doesn't mean that this was their tribe names, in other words. It would be as if archaeologists of the future didn't have the place names or the specific information about San Francisco and Oakland, but they were able to put together enough evidence to conclude that there is this area called the Bay Area, right, in general, that seemed to share some qualities across space. So that's what these two words are referring to. Now, the Hohokam and Anasazi civilizations did not have beasts of burden, they did not have writing, they did not have the wheel, yet they built substantial stone and adobe towns, one of which you see a picture of here. This is Mesa Verde in southwest Colorado. You can go see this today. I highly recommend it. It's very extraordinary. So despite these tools of civilization that European people usually tend to think of as central to building anything, right, that's substantial or impressive, they did all of this without writing, right, or beasts of burden or the wheel. They also built extensive irrigation systems to provide them with sufficient water for agriculture in the semi-arid Southwest, right? It's often very deserty and dry in the Southwest, so they adapted to that situation by building irrigation systems. They also maintained trade ties and some cultural similarities with the centers of civilization in central Mexico. So they also had some cultural contact with cultures different from theirs, but nearby. Now, during the 13th and 14th centuries, most of the Anasazi and Hohokam abandoned their towns due to, as far as we can tell, environmental strains and a long drought period that made the place no longer inhabitable. So before Europeans ever arrived in North America, they had already abandoned these settlements. Now, some of these groups would go on to form what we call the Acoma, Hopi, and Zuni pueblos, but the term pueblos itself, which is the most common term, sort of in common parlance, to refer to the native societies in the Southwest region, that was a term coined by Spanish colonizers. So that's why we get this term pueblos. It's not a self-identified term. A very different North American, Native American civilization were known as the Mound Builders, and they lived in the Mississippi Valley after 800 AD, about to the 13th century of the modern era. And they built big towns around central plazas that featured a very large earthen pyramid. So here's a picture of one of the largest ones that still exist, and you can go and see. Now, the Mound Builders, which is what we call them because we have no idea what they called themselves, engaged in agriculture. So they were gardeners, and they built these large pyramids largely because they developed a very hierarchical society. The chiefs lived in these pyramids, and they were considered quasi-sacred beings. So they were semi-divine, the chiefs of the mound builders. And we also know that they practiced human sacrifice. So there's some similarities here, as we'll also briefly touch on at the end of the lecture, with some civilizations, such as the Aztecs down in South America. We don't exactly know what those connections are, if they developed fully independently or in concert with each other, right, in communication. Evidence is very scattered, but we know that at least that similarity was there. Now, the place now called Cahokia, which is just east of St. Louis today, was the biggest center of the mound builders. And this is an illustration of what it probably looks like at its height. The big mound in Cahokia contained over 800,000 cubic yards of earth, and it covered 16 acres, and it rose 110 feet high. And this was a particularly large settlement. Archaeologists estimate that at its height, perhaps as many 40,000 people lived there during the 12th and 13th centuries. And if you stop and look at that timeline, you realize it would make it as big as the largest European cities of the same period. So we often think, right, of the Americas as being discovered by more civilized people, right, and they had not changed for hundreds and hundreds of years, but that's quite inaccurate, right? Whole civilizations rose and fell in the Americas before Europeans ever even set foot on them. And the mound builders was one of the most monumental ones, right? And I mean that mostly literally rather than figuratively, in North America. There's definitely very large monumental civilizations in Central and South America, but in North America, this is about as big as it got. So, for the sake of perspective, consider that in North America, a colonial city built by Europeans would only reach that size of Cahokia at its site after the establishment of the United States towards the late 18th century. So it wasn't until the late 1700s that European cities get to the height of Cahokia. So just again, for a little perspective here to complicate our usual narratives of how civilized people meet uncivilized people. Now, the remnants of the civilization created much smaller, but still substantial villages in Alabama, Georgia, and eastern Oklahoma. But the environmental strains did make this particular formation of the mound builders uninhabitable for such a large population. So these sites, these centers, were abandoned in the middle of the 13th century and broke up into several smaller bands. However, and now we're going to engage in a little fast and loose generalization, unfortunately inherent to this kind of quick discussion of something that's very complex. Most Native American cultures, especially those on the East Coast, which we'll be paying particular attention to during this course, due to them being the first ones, right, that most North American colonists come to contact with. Most of these indigenous cultures did share some similarities and lived in much less complex inhabitations and left much less archaeological records behind than a civilization like the mound builders. So, what are some of these similarities? Well, most indigenous societies engaged in a combination of horticulture and hunting and gathering, and they moved from season to season. So they would live in these sort of semi-permanent settlements that were never permanent, right, where they were always going to be, but they would stay for a season, right, before moving on, according to the weather. Most also operated under a system of distinct gender roles. So men hunted, they fished, they fought, and they ruled. They possessed the majority of the political power, while women took care of everything else, basically, including agriculture, growing the food, and preparing food and artisanal work of various kinds. So they grew the food, they cooked the food, and they made the pots and pans. You can kind of think of it like that, in addition to a lot of other artisanal crafts. Now, this gender division is both similar and different from European societies in the same time period. In European societies, the type of work ascribed to each gender was different. European women were not supposed to work in the field, right? They were not supposed to be involved in the hard labor of agriculture if they could possibly avoid it. That was associated with and considered the duty of men. However, they're similar in the sense that both European and Native societies did have distinct and separate roles for men and women, and men still held more power. They still had the majority of political power in Native societies, and this is despite the fact that most of these indigenous cultures were matrilineal. Now, what that means is that the family ties were traced through the mother, not the father, right? According to European traditional practice, two people get married, the woman takes the man's last name. Well, they didn't really have last names exactly, right? But if they had them, they wouldn't have done that. They would have taken the woman's last name, because the blood ties, the way that people were understood to be related to each other, and the ties that counted to create that unit were traced through women, were traced through the mother. So this did afford women more power than was typical in the European societies they would soon contact. However, I don't want to give the impression that Native American societies were some sort of gender equality paradise. That's definitely not true. Women were still shut out of most of the political power that men had a much stronger hold on. However, they do have some advantages that European women lacked. A good example of some consequences of this matrilineal line, the most important adult-youth male relationship in most of these indigenous cultures was not between the father and the son. It was between the uncle and his nephews and nieces. And the reason that is because the uncle would be clearest the next male inheritance of the bloodline that mattered, which was what? The bloodline of your mother. So if you're a young boy, your bloodline is traced through your mother, so it's her brother that is presumed to be the most important male role model for you growing up, not your father. So that's something that's very, very different. Also, usually the men would move into the woman's home rather than the woman moving into the man's home. So these are some significant differences from European societies. Another common similarity across these different groups is that Native religion and spirituality held that the nature around them was animated with spirits. Therefore, they believed that all their interactions with their surroundings, their physical surroundings, involved spiritual forces. Now, this was a reflection of the environment they were in, because in order to live in peace with their environment, they were hoping, right, that they would be able to anticipate what practices would anger and please these spirits. So it reflected this constant problem, of just surviving, that they had to deal with this immediate environment that could be very dangerous, right, and could wipe you out if things went bad, right, if there was a horrible snow season that destroyed all your crops, right, starvation was a thing that could actually happen. So it became very important to manage the forces of nature. Now, I want to emphasize that this is not a harmonious system of thought that was akin to modern environmental sensibilities or a kind of new agey idea about being one with nature for the sake of being one with nature, right? This is not like going on a hike and looking at the mountains and being like, oh, the butterflies are so beautiful and I feel so calm and relaxed now, right? This is an attempt. Their religion was an expression of an attempt to assert as much control as they could over their lives in a very harsh and dangerous world that they had limited control over, right? They couldn't control the weather. Nobody can, right? Unless, we just heat up the whole earth to make it worse. But, as we're busy doing now, right? But, on the whole, it is true that you can't control the weather. So much like any other religion, this system of belief addressed the challenges and the needs of Native American life, right? It's pragmatic. It's a reflection of what the daily struggles of lived life was like. And their religion helped them believe that they had some ability to assert control over a very dangerous and volatile environment. So if nothing else, and sometimes this might actually involve practices, right, that were actually beneficial, even if, they didn't realize it and or it was couched in terms of a religious practice, even if it didn't have, right, any kind of direct positive benefit we can identify today, it was at least socially and psychologically, right, helpful to feel like you had some control over the situation. So effectively, this belief in a spirited world, in a nature animated and inhabited by spiritual beings, led Native Americans to treat their surroundings much more carefully than Europeans, who, if you look at the European religion at this time, and the vast majority of colonists that are coming over are Christian of one sort or another, right? Either Catholic or Protestant. We'll get to the differences between those two soon in a different lecture. But for time being, they were Christian, right? And they believed in a God who ordained them, right? Who created them to subdue nature rather than to appease and manage nature. Right? In European cultures, their major religion told them that humans were superior to everything else, and particularly Christian peoples were superior to all else. And this belief system helped them believe that their colonial efforts in coming in to North America, and before that South America, and their attempts to tame the environment and to establish control over native peoples were just. Because to European eyes, indigenous people were just letting nature off the hook, so to speak. They were spoiling it, and they were not effectively taming her or whipping her into shape, so to speak, right? So they did not understand the pragmatic purposes and the hundreds of years of experience built up that had led to the development of Native American cultures and the way that they both worshipped and also managed their environment. And this gets us to how these two very different groups of people thought of one another when their worlds first collided. Now, as I think is pretty well known now, prior to Columbus and his famous voyage, there were some Nordic sailors, i.e. Vikings, who had landed in North America hundreds of years prior. But nothing really came of that. It didn't work out. They all died or went home. So, for the sake of sustained, permanent contact, first contact comes, as we all know, right, starting in 1492. So, when this first contact originally happened in the late 15th century, there were 50 million inhabitants in the Americas, in North and South America. Now, only 5 million of those were in North America, so the vast majority of population was in Central and South America. Now, ships up and down South America and Central America, particularly Spanish and Portuguese, started arriving starting in 1492 and increasing over the years. And what would have native peoples have seen off the shores then? They would have seen these huge wooden ships of a type they'd never witnessed, steel weapons, gunpowder, and horses, which had existed in America previously, but then had gone extinct. So by the time the Spanish and the Portuguese bring them back, Native Americans don't recognize them. They don't have any memory of these weirdo beasts. All of these things, right, unknown to indigenous people in America. So, not surprisingly, they were treated with much suspicion and speculation, especially as these contacts went on from the initial one, because with the Europeans tended to come diseases that would wipe out thousands of people. They tended to act violently and unpredictably, but they did have useful tools for trade, so there was also some incentive to interact with these people. So initially there was a certain suspicion amongst indigenous people that Europeans were somehow supernatural beings, either benevolent or increasingly they came to guess malignant, right? Malignant is not the right word. Maleficent, as things did not go well. Now, if we want to try to perhaps get a glimpse of how Native Americans perceived Europeans, we might try to imagine how we would react to the arrival of aliens from space today without knowing what technology they had or what their agenda was. And rather than making it perfectly clear from the beginning what their agenda was, mostly they just sort of stumble around after they got off their spaceships. They speak weird languages, and they're vaguely trying to communicate something, then they sporadically break out in violence for reasons that you don't know why, right? So this is just a very existentially disturbing event, right, for indigenous people. Now, since they did not share languages that were even really remotely similar, and they obviously did not share culture, much of what exactly occurred in these early encounters, when you really have these two completely alien societies meeting one another, so much of this is lost in translation, and there's a lot of misunderstanding going on, right? It's hard to cobble this together, but one thing we can be very sure about is that there was a lot of confusion and miscommunication. And there's two examples of this involving place names that are kind of interesting. So, for example, there's speculation over the origin of the names the Yucatan, which is where the Mayan civilization existed in Central America, and Canada. And both of these speculations are a good example of what was lost in translation. For instance, some suggest that the name Yucatan originated from a phrase that meant "I don't understand" in Mayan. So, when these European colonizers were trying to talk to the Mayan civilization, the Mayan people were, understandably enough, saying, "I don't understand, I got no clue what you're talking about." But the Spanish interpreted that to mean, like, oh, the name of this place is Yucatan. Right? We don't know. We don't know if this is exactly how it happened, but this is a guess that some scholars have made. Similarly, in Canada, in Spanish, the Spanish language, acá nada means nothing here. Now, some suggest that Native Americans had learned that the Spanish down in South and Central America were looking for gold, that news had traveled right up from South to North America by that time. And they had been advised, right, by this sort of grapevine of indigenous societies that if they came around, if Europeans landed on your shores, best to tell them that there's nothing here, right? So they lose interest and they go away. However, though, right, by the time that Native peoples learned what this was in Spanish and it made it all the way up to Canada, indigenous societies in Canada, it wasn't the Spanish who showed up in Canada, it was the French. So perhaps the Native Americans there were trying to say to the French people, there's nothing here, go away, and you have this acá nada being interpreted eventually as Canada, as a place name. Now there's also all these other theories about where the name Canada comes from. So again, these are all speculations, but it's telling, right, that we have to speculate, that actually we don't really know how these places were named if we don't have the original native place names. Now, as epidemics and conquests took their toll, morale in the indigenous world started breaking. Their cultures suffered a devastating blow. This is particularly true in Central and South America because they were the first contacted, and the Spanish had pretty much raiding in mind, right? It was not a peaceful process at all. And particularly the first groups of indigenous people that came in touch with the colonists had the hardest time because they were usually the first to have these massive epidemics and also to have these massive campaigns of violence waged against them, right? Because all of this happened without any warning, so to speak, right? There was no prior experience of how to deal with these weird, funny-looking Europeans if they showed up in your environment. Now, the earliest sources that we have to get a feel from the perspective of indigenous people for what this is like are compilations of narratives drawn out in the early 16th century as missionaries taught natives in Mexico how to use an alphabet for their language. And they incorporated these codices of Natual, which is the name of the language here, pictographic writing. Here is an image of one of these early sources that, although it is using native language and is written from a native perspective, it's also being filtered through Europeans, right? So it's still not as close to these original cultures as we would like it to be, right? This was with the assistance of missionaries. So this is after a lot of devastation had probably happened. and a lot of social dislocation that happened to these cultures. So we do not know very well exactly what occurred from the perspective of indigenous people as the European colonization swept across Central South America and North America as time went on. Now, mostly historians, therefore, have had to rely on sources written by Europeans themselves. The problem with that is Europeans often projected their own ideas regarding the customs of the natives and how they acted during these early encounters. And that's why, and we'll look at a specific example of that at the very end of lecture, that's why a people's history is not always easy to tell from the perspective of indigenous people, that is, right? Because so many of our sources are basically filtered through the eyes of Europeans. But nonetheless, we can make an effort to do so, and we do have sparse but precious primary sources where you are able to see this native perspective shine through. So, for example, this is a section from a manuscript called Broken Spears, which captures an Aztec account of the conquest by the Spanish. So I'm just going to read this out loud. If you'd rather just read it to yourself, feel free to mute me for about the next minute. Broken spears lie in the roads. We have torn our hair in our grief. The houses are roofless now, and their walls are red with blood. Worms are swarming in the streets and plazas, and the walks are spattered with gore. The water has turned red as if it were dyed, and when we drink it, it has the taste of brine. We have pounded our heads, our hands in despair against the adobe walls. For our inheritance, our city is lost and dead. The shields of our warriors were its defense, but they could not save it. We have chewed dry twigs and salt grasses. We have filled our mouths with dust and bits of adobe. We have eaten lizards, rats, and worms. We have had meat, and we almost ate it raw. Our cries of grief rise up, and our tears rain down, for Tlacato is lost. The Aztecs are fleeing across the lake. They are running away like women. How can we save our homes, my people? The Aztecs are deserting the city. The city is in flames, and all is darkness and destruction. Weep, my people. Know that with these disasters, we have lost the Mexican nation. The water has turned bitter. Our food is bitter. These are the acts of the giver of life. So, a complete and total sense of devastation, right? Everything you know, everything you valued, the order of your world and your civilization just torn apart and completely destroyed. And also notice, right, that last line, these are the acts of the giver of life. So we have a glimpse here, just a kind of mention of how somehow they were struggling to rely on their religious frameworks to make sense of this experience. Now, another example of that religious framework.
Now this, I'm not going to read this
let's see.
word for word, but you can just pause the presentation in a moment and read for yourself. It is the first letter of Cortez from Mexico. And in it, he describes a lot of unflattering things from his perspective about Native American cultures. And something you might want to consider here. You can go ahead and pause it for a moment if you want to finish up and reading it. Is how, to European eyes, certain aspects of Native American cultures must have been very easy to condemn and find horrifying, not without reason. He talks particularly in here about human sacrifice, okay, which was practiced by Aztec civilization, the Aztec civilization. But looking at that, right, as sort of the emblem, the thing, the lens through which you understand the rest of the civilization, think about how that would create problems, right? A misunderstanding, reduce a civilization that has all sorts of aspects and complexities to one, act of violence. And a good way to think about this is Cortez is pretty horrified by this human sacrifice, which is understandable enough, but imagine if, at actually very roughly the same time, the time he's writing this, a Native American traveled to Europe, and the first thing they saw was a woman being executed for witchcraft by being burned to death. Not only did this happen to some women, there was actually a period in Europe of about 200 years where thousands and thousands of women were executed for witchcraft in various horrible ways. There was a witchcraft scare, so to speak. This is actually something we'll talk about a little bit later when we get into the early colonies. But for now, just think about if that is what you saw, right, and that's your first impression, so to speak, and you don't understand anything else that's going on, you're going to have a pretty bad impression and understanding of that civilization from there on out, right? Because like human sacrifice, burning women alive for being witches is a pretty violent and terrifying thing. Okay, so that finishes up our first lecture
for today, finishing off that audio file that got clipped. Next up, what is next up? Yes, so next up we're going to discuss European cultures at this time period, right? So we're talking about native cultures this lecture, and now we're going to look at what is up with European culture at the time of contact when they first start coming over to the New World. So see you on the side of that.